Hi everyone, thanks for checking out this video. If you're new to my channel, I don't post updates very often, so make sure you subscribe and click the bell so that you can get notified whenever I upload new content. The Legion of the Infernal Skull is my Vampire Counts army, and I've been collecting and painting it for about 27 years. On my hobby blog, I recently posted a collection of all the lore and backstory for the characters and units, and if you want to read about that, I have a link in the description. In this video, I'm going to give you a visual tour of the entire army and talk about the models themselves, the conversion work, and some of my inspiration for how everything came together. When playing D&D as a kid, I was always fascinated by the undead, so when I was introduced to Warhammer, that's naturally what I gravitated towards. The first unit I collected was this regiment of skeletons. They started as just a small box of the old mid-90s plastic skeletons, and the box came with a decal sheet, one of which depicted a red hooded wraith with a scythe. And I thought that was a great image for the unit, and I converted all the models to carry scythes, because back in 5th edition, skeletons could be equipped with great weapons. I expanded the unit by mixing in a few old metal skeletons that were armed with scythes, and converted some of the early 2000s plastic skeletons and gave them scythes from the plastic zombie regiment. And I drew a banner to match the shield iconography, and I called the unit the Crimson Reapers. In the 5th edition Undead Army book, Wraiths used to be unit champions, so it was only appropriate to have a red-hooded Wraith leading the Crimson Reapers. This model for Korak the Grim is just an old metal Wraith painted to match the Red Hood imagery. After Korak, I added the Necromancer Neiman Kimmel, and he's converted from a Necromunda Arch-Zealot with all of the 40k bits removed. This original model had a flaming skull icon on the book and on his hat, and this, plus my love of Ghost Rider, would go on to inspire the main imagery for the entire army. I gave him a staff with a flaming skull, and that was some of the first sculpting that I ever did. Those are my first two named characters, and while I haven't ever made a new version of Neiman Kimmel, Korak the Grim got a bit of a glow-up in 2016. This new version of Korak is kit-bashed from the Wraith-like spirits on the Mortis engine, with the sleeves from the corpse cart driver, and a lot of sculpting to fill out his robes. In subsequent editions of Warhammer, Wraiths became hero-level characters, so Korak was promoted from a mere unit champion, and now he's the chief lieutenant for the spectral regiments of the Legion. Taking a look at the rest of the spectral units, these are the Phantom Lamenters. We had to wait all the way until the end times to finally get some nice Spirit Host models, so these are among my newer units. Behind them are my Hex Wraiths, the Shadow Riders of Shyish. Since I went with a flaming motif on all the wights in my army, the Hex Wraiths have been converted to replace their flames with ethereal wisps to better distinguish them from my Black Knights. I also gave them some more substantial scythes from the plastic zombie kit. In the back is an old Wraith unit. Through the years, Wraiths have gone back and forth between being solo characters or rare units, and this batch is a mix of metal Vampire Counts Wraiths and the older Ghost models converted to carry scythes. In the center is Korak the Grim's Mortis engine. The main conversion work I did on this was to modify the Necromancer to look more like a Wraith, and I sculpted more fire on the flaming skeletons. In my army's lore, this Mortis engine houses Korak's physical remains, allowing him to tap into his former necromantic abilities. So in game terms, Korak gets to play as a Necromancer mounted on a Mortis engine. I don't usually paint object source lighting, but I thought it was appropriate here, and it carries the firelight into the ethereal bits to help tie the different elements together. Like the Wraiths, Banshees have also had many roles over the years. The second model from the left is from the 5th edition Circle of Blood campaign, and the others have been everything from heroes to champions for Wraith units. In 2018, I kit-bashed the Banshee Queen Olivia von Koss and her Choir of Death, and they're made from a combination of the Coven Throne vampires, plastic banshees, some witch elf hair, and Olivia has Neferata's dress and the collar from a plastic necromancer. All the way in the back are some of my oldest models, dating back to 5th edition. On the left is a White Lord made from the champion of the mounted White unit that would later become the first Black Knights in the Vampire Counts army list. The Cavalry Regiment was my first unit of Hellfire Knights, and they're made from the old plastic skeleton horsemen from the mid-90s. The banner was hand-drawn and colored with marker, and this is where my concept for the Legion of the Infernal Skull really took off, and I began using the flaming skull in all of my heraldry. The white on foot was an earlier version of my battle standard bearer. The banner pole was pinned into the top of his hand so that I could swap it between the banner pole and an axe head. And he's made from a metal white champion and the gauntlets from an old plastic Chaos Warrior. I call this big scenery piece the Tombs of Tithing. I have a separate video on my channel with detailed shots and a rotation of the whole thing, so I definitely recommend checking that out. These are some of my earlier character models, some of which have been upgraded with newer versions. There's the Red Duke. He's a metal model from the old Circle of Blood campaign from 5th edition. My first version of Marduk the Wolf. That's a vampire that I converted from the Red Duke's body and horse head, and the barding was cut from an Empire horse and placed over a skeleton steed. Dimitri von Koss is another vampire that I made from the lower half of Krell and the upper half of the Red Duke. I used the top of Krell's banner pole for the shield icon, and I think he has Vlad von Karstein's sword and the crown from a Metal Black Knight. Last, we have Heinrich Kemmler. I've had this in my bits box since the 90s and finally painted to use in the Age of Sigmar because the basic Necromancer's rules were pretty underwhelming, and he's built stock. I haven't done any conversion work with him at all. Getting back to my main regiments, these zombies are the Nameless Rabble. Most of them are from the old Plastic Zombie Regiment kit, but I have a few of the really old metal zombies scattered throughout. For the standard bearers, I use the old metal Storm Vermin banner poles with flames sculpted on top and hand-drawn banners. Next to the zombies are 2 corpse carts. I sculpted the flaming skulls on the back to represent their Balefire Brazier upgrades. The corpse cart on the left has been converted with crows all over it, picking at the dead. To make the Corpse Master, I used the cloak from the Plastic Necromancer and sculpted a Plague Doctor's mask, which gives him a bird-like appearance, tying him in with the crow motif. The one on the right didn't have too much work done. Mainly I've added a skull at the front with wings from an old plastic bat. And these Necromancers are Neiman Kimmel's disciples. Totnemesis has 2 versions, one on foot and one on a nightmare. The model he's based on is the Mordheim Necromancer, and his horse is from the Metal Lord of Nurgle. I think the book he's holding on the horse came from a Metal Sisters of Battle Canoness or something. The other Necromancer is Samus Gars, and his model is the Dark Emissary from the Albion campaign in the early 2000s. The horns have been removed, and I modified his staff with a flaming Beastman skull. These Skeleton Spearmen are another of my early units, added as my force was really beginning to shape up, transitioning from the old Undead army list to the new Vampire Counts army. It's made from the early 2000s plastic regiment box with older metal command models. The banner top is from a Space Marine Terminator Librarian, and the banner itself is hand-drawn. I was really inspired by the units pictured in the 6th edition Vampire Counts book and modeled these skeletons emerging from the ground. As much as I like this unit, I'd never given it a name, and it doesn't really match the aesthetic of the rest of the army. But they're my only skeletons armed with spears, so I haven't retired them yet. I'll figure something out for them. Now we're moving on to the feral aspect of my army, where ghouls, wolves, and bats are the mainstay. These metal ghouls are from the late 90s, early 2000s, and I much prefer these to the hunched-over, spiky-haired, bone-piercing, stabbed-through-them plastic ghoul kit. I've converted a few of these with different knives and body parts that they're eating, and I plan to add more with fur pelts and accessories like the meat and knives from the Kroot Warriors and Ogre Kingdoms kits. I started publishing my blog in 2012, and the conversion of this VARGHULF was one of my earliest posts. I wanted to give the basic VARGHULF model a bit more stature, so I replaced his arms and wings with plastic Balrog wings. It took a lot of sculpting to add the fur and extend the wing membranes to connect with his body. The wings themselves were scraped with a rounded blade, and holes were cut out to make them appear more stretched and tattered. This remains one of my favorite conversions in the army. Next we have the Terrorgheist Nachtmar, the Living Nightmare. I did some subtle reposing of the model to get him perched on that ruined wall, and of course I magnetized his wings so that he can be transported more easily. Behind Nachtmar is another VARGHULF. This is a model I threw together and painted very quickly just to get him finished. I plan to go back and convert him with more impressive wings to match the other VARGHULF and then give him a completely new paint job. Up here you can see the evolution of my Fellbats. In the first Vampire Counts army book during the tail end of Warhammer 5th edition, these metal bats were simply called Vampire Bats, and the 4 in the back are just the stock metal bats. That little bat on the end is a messenger bat that I made for a scenario. And in front, are my second iteration of Fell Bat. These were converted from the classic metal bats with wings from the Warmaster scale wyvern. And fun fact, these were featured in the 2004-2005 GW Catalog and Hobby reference, along with a few of my other models. As with the Fell Bats, my dire wolves also evolved over the years. My earliest dire wolves were just the basic GW plastic wolf, the same one that came with the Goblin Wolf Riders. The official dire wolf kit used the same plastic wolf body with a metal head, and there was an all-metal Doom Wolf as well. This unit contains a mix of all of them, and it even marks the point in my hobby journey where I learned how to use modeling putty to fill seams and gaps, because the newest ones have fur sculpted over the neck joint. These Doomhounds are led by Marduk the Wolf. This is my second version of the character. The base model was the old metal skeleton warrior with axe, and I gave him a head from a ghoul and sculpted a wolf pelt over his shoulders. The feet on the pelt were cut from the plastic Space Wolf accessory sprue. Marduk would eventually grow in power and evolve into a Ghoul King. Even though he's technically of Blood Dragon descent, I treat him as having gone completely feral. The model is the Ghoul King from the Terrorgheist kit, with his lower legs replaced with normal feet from a metal ghoul. The axe handle was sculpted, and I think the axe head itself was from Grimgore Ironhide. He's also got a wolf pelt, and the body on his base was taken from the corpse cart. And the Fell Bats have revealed their final form. These are the newest plastic Fell Bats, and I love them so much they don't even need any converting, although I did do a little work on their tree stands to vary the height and allow them to rank up easily. As I record this, I've already got 4 more underway, so I can increase the unit size to 10. In front of the Fell Bats are my Bat Swarms, and these are made from Warmaster scale Fell Bats, and they are all meticulously pinned together and attached to the tombstones on their bases. At the head of this winged coven is the vampire Lucinda Vale. Lucinda was converted from Lady Annika, and I replaced her arms with wings from one of the plastic Fell Bats. Her protector is the Vengorian Lord Mordrak von Skor. The two of them are actually the inhabitants of the Tombs of Tithing that I mentioned previously. To create Mordrak, I converted the basic Vengorian Lord model by replacing the upper vampire torso with the head from Manfred's Dread Abyssal and some sculpted fur. His armor was kit-bashed from the plastic Black Knight Barding and a few bits from the plastic Blood Knights. I initially planned on running Mordrak as a VARGHULF, but I think he might be better served as a vampire count mounted on an Abyssal Terror, and I've already made a new base for him, so he'll have the correct footprint. We've already seen Marduk the Ghoul King. This is his Terrorgheist, Volkar. On the base is a small cutout so I can either field it as a solo monster, or pop out that tombstone and slot in Marduk as its rider. This was the first Terrorgheist I built back in 2013. The other Terrorgheist, Noctmar, was finished in 2019. This kit was so intricate and gorgeous that I didn't even consider converting it. The real work went into modeling the base and magnetizing the wings and tail so I could transport him in a miniature case. One added detail is that little bat swarm by Reaper Miniatures on the round base. I use it as a token to remind me that the Terrorgheist is infested and will explode into a cloud of bats when it dies, inflicting damage to anyone around it. I call these dire wolves the Doomhounds of Marduk. They were converted in around 2004 from the old metal Chaos Warhounds. I chose those models because they had torn up faces with exposed skulls and holes in their sides with ribs showing through, details that were perfect for undead wolves. I cut off all of the spikes on the Chaos Hounds and resculpted a lot of the fur detail. Then I finished them off with plastic wolf tails and ears cut from the plastic wolf heads. The larger Doom Wolves came much later in 2012, and they were made from Space Wolf Thunder Wolves, with all of their cybernetic bits replaced with sculpted damage and gore. The Vampire Luther Vogsteel is the most recent addition to the Legion. This conversion uses the metal body of Konrad von Karstein, with newly sculpted arms and shoulder pads. Konrad's original head was replaced with the face from a corpse cart driver and a new head sculpted around it. My original plan for this model was to make a Vampire Thrall battle standard bearer, but after the end times there didn't seem much point to it, so the model languished on my shelf of shame for years. In 2022, I finally decided to finish him. I completely resculpted the arms and gave him new weapons. My dream of extending his cape of bats was made possible thanks to the bat swarms in the Curse City box set. I added a bunch of bats flying out from his cape, and it really completes the miniature. Before we move on to the martial aspect of the Legion, here are a couple of allied regiments. The Red Rain Host represents Tomb King's skeleton archers. I made these during the end times when Nagash united the Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings into a single army list called Undead Legions. The unit's more gothic appearance implies that they were raised from local casualties, either Empire or Bretonnian troops. For the models, I used the old metal armored skeleton spearmen. Their arms have been replaced with plastic arms and bows from the Graveguard and Tomb King sprues, and the unit champions incorporate more bits from the Tomb King's chariot crew. Overseeing the Red Rain host is Tomb Prince Selketa. He's converted from the Tomb King's Herald miniature. I replaced the arms and head with other Tomb King's bits and did a fair amount of sculpting on his cape. This version represents Selketa in his traveling clothes. He's got a helmet from the Graveguard kit and a Vampire Count themed sword, so he'll match the aesthetic of his northern allies. This year, I finished a version of Selketa in his home colors for my Old World Tomb King's army. This one has more of a Desert Scorpion motif. The helmet comes from the Blood Bowl Khemri Team accessory pack with some extra scorpion detail sculpted on. I actually made 2 of those heads, and I'm saving the other one for a mounted version of the character. The martial aspect of the army is primarily made up of skeletons and wights, and represents the units that assembled once the Blood Dragon vampires took control. These are the Red Guard skeletons, and they're kitbashed from the 2000s era Skeleton Regiment and parts from the Empire State Troops and Free Company. A few of them have metal heads taken from the old metal Graveguard kit. The leader of the Von Koss vampires is Seth Von Koss, and I have 3 different models for him. This version of him on foot is made from the Games Day exclusive Archaon. I swapped his head for a Blood Dragon vampire head, and I added a skeleton shield icon to his chest. The wings on his shield are from a Warmaster Fellbat, and the sword blade is from Mephiston. The Archaon model was standing on a huge rock, and I had to remove that and resculpt his feet entirely. He barely fits on that 20mm base, and I had to make spacers to replace the skeletons around him when he joined a unit. This guy's been begging for a 25mm base for 20 years. Next to Seth are his White King lieutenants, the Sepulchral Sentinels. They're both converted from the plastic White King model, with lots of sculpting work and extra parts added to make them distinct. Their great axes are from the Hordes model Madrak Ironhide. The Wights in the Legion truly embody the Flaming Skull motif, and all of my Graveguard have flames sculpted on their skulls. The Execution Guards seen here are classic metal Graveguard, converted to be equipped with great weapons. They're 40 men strong and one of my toughest units. Behind them are the Inferno Guard, my first unit of Graveguard. They're kitbashed with skirts from the Dark Elf Warriors, torsos from the Empire State Troops, Kroot shoulder pads, and skeleton arms and heads. The banners in these units were hand-drawn like the others, but for these newer banners, I scanned the line art and colored it in Photoshop, and then printed them out on high-quality laser paper. And speaking of banners, here's the battle standard for the Legion of the Infernal Skull and the Von Koss family. Carrying the banner is the White Lord Oren Koth. The base model that I used for this conversion was a metal Blood Dragon vampire wearing what I always assumed to be was a representation of the flayed hauberk. The top of the banner pole is decorated with trophy skulls and zombie parts, and the larger skull at the top is from the 54mm Inquisitor range with wings from a plastic bat. The vampire beside him is Dmitri Von Koss. This is a new version of the character that I converted from the metal Batwing vampire. I removed the wing and sculpted a new arm, and his breastplate was taken from the 2008 plastic skeleton kit, and I gave him a Blood Dragon head. The wings on his helmet are from the familiar that came with the Batwing vampire. The Red Guard skeletons are Dimitri's personal retinue, so I always have him leading them in battle. At the head of the cavalry is another model of Oren Koth, now on horseback. This time I used the mounted version of that same vampire wearing the flayed hauberk. For Oren's mount, I used the horse and the cape from the plastic Empire General kit. This conversion incorporated a lot more sculpting. I had to replace his shield arm, and I sculpted flames over the shield icons. My original intention for this model was for it to be a mounted version of the Battle Standard Bearer, but when Age of Sigmar eliminated battle standards, I gave him a sword and finished him off as a regular White Lord. Now that the old world is back, it wouldn't be too much trouble to remove that sword and replace it with a banner pole. The bulk of the Vampire Count's cavalry is made up of Black Knights. These are the Hellfire Knights, successors to my original unit of skeleton cavalry. I have 40 of these guys, originally built around 2004 in the good old days of being able to purchase individual metal bits. I didn't finish painting all of them though until 2013. To convert them, I used the legs and skirting from the classic Bretonnian plastic horses with Empire barding over top. The horse heads and tails are from Manfred von Karstein's horse. The riders have the legs from the old metal Chaos Knights and torsos from the metal armored skeleton spearmen, and their lances are from the mounted Blood Dragon Vampire Lord. The black coach has always been one of my favorite centerpiece models, and I converted mine into a chariot worthy of the Blood Dragon. First up, I armored the skeleton steeds and replaced their heads with metal heads from the Red Duke's horse. On the coach itself, I replaced the braziers with flaming skulls, and I added the skull and wings from the old metal zombie dragon. The Ghost Rider influence is on full display with those flaming wheels, and the skull and wolf tails on the back are from a goblin wolf chariot. The little coach is a counter to keep track of the coach's evocation of death. That special rule has changed throughout the editions, but basically the coach would accumulate power as it killed things or siphoned magic dice. The counter is made from a War Master scale version of the black coach, also converted with a little War Master dragon skull and wings. Don't talk to me or my son ever again. The Blood Knights of the Crimson Inferno were a unit that took me ages to finally realize. I always wanted to make a cheaper, better-looking alternative to the old metal Blood Knights, and I was finally able to do that by combining steeds from the Nighthaunt Dreadblade Harrows, the Vampire Lords from the Zombie Dragon kit, and some barding from the Plastic Black Knights. The leader of the unit is Victor von Harken, and he's kit-bashed from the Mortarch version of Manfred, with some parts from the Plastic Vampire Lord. The saddles and skull icons on the shields were sculpted from scratch, with added wings from a plastic bat. To match the fiery aesthetic of the army, I painted the manes, tails, and ethereal bits of the horses to look like flames. In the end, I think all these parts were only slightly cheaper than the metal unit, but I like these so much more, and at least adding more Blood Knights to the army will be much easier with the new plastic kit. These are the other two models for Seth von Koss, one on a Nightmare and one on a Zombie Dragon. As with his foot version, Seth is based on the metal Archaon model. In fact, I made the foot version because in older editions, monstrous mounts and their riders took damage separately. That way Seth would be able to continue on foot if his dragon was shot out from underneath him. This is the metal zombie dragon from the Melchior kit, and apart from adding holes in the plastic wings, it's built pretty much stock. The real work went into removing the metal Archaon from his horse and adding him to a saddle that can be pinned onto the dragon. The original dragon was on a 50mm base, so I made a magnetized base extension to be in line with the base size of the new plastic model. The one mounted on the steed is just Archaon with all the chaos details removed and the head and weapons added. The flaming hooves and hair on the steed were an homage to Venger's horse from the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon, and this mount used to represent a flying hell steed, but in later editions it's been relegated to just a nightmare. This was the first version of Seth that I built, and the dragon and foot versions came later. The rock on his base is actually a piece of quartz, and that base was originally for my old mounted Battle Standard Bearer. I got rid of that model ages ago because it wasn't very good, but I kept the base and repainted it to use with my general. I've saved Nagash and his agents for last. In the end times, we got a brand new Nagash model and the Morghasts. I call these the Harbingers of the Inferno, and I built them with the option to swap their weapons so I can field them either as Morghast Archai with the halberds, seen here, or as Morghast Harbingers with two hand weapons. They used to have ghostly bits under their wings, but I converted mine to stand on top of some shrines and crypts from my Skullforged SCENICS range of resin terrain. Unfortunately, the Morghasts did not make a return in the old world, since it's set before their creation during the end times, and they're only in the Ossiarch Bone Reapers list for the Age of Sigmar, so I really don't get to play with them anymore. I don't know, maybe I could pass them off as sepulchral stalkers or something in my Tomb King's army. This is the Infernal Headsman, made from a Nighthaunt Lord Executioner. I removed the gallows on his back and replaced his hands with skeletal hands, and of course sculpted fire over all the ethereal bits. I'm planning to use him as either a Wraith or a White King. And last, but certainly not least, we've come to the big man himself, Nagash. One of the big changes I made to this model was to shorten the hat and replace his tiny head with a skull from a bone giant. I completely resculpted the jaw and the teeth, so the eye sockets are really the only part of the original metal that's still visible. To tie Nagash into my army, I sculpted fire over all of the spirit trails, and I painted the tattered portion of his robe to look like it was burning away. The books were also opened, breaking free of their bonds. In addition to some sculpting work, I used thin styrene to make some loose pages. I built the model with the intention of being able to swap him between my vampire accounts and an eventual Tomb King's army, so Nagash's body is clipped into the skirt. I have a second set of robes and spirits that I was intending to model with a desert theme, so the model would match the basing of whichever army he led by simply changing out the bottom skirt and base. And that's the entire Legion of the Infernal Skull. Thanks for watching and putting up with my droning, monotonous voice for the past half hour. I hope you've enjoyed seeing everything and hearing about how the army came together. In the video description, I have links to my blog where you can find all of my social media and my Skullforge SCENICS shop. The description also has links to the Legion's lore and a few posts featuring the conversion work for some of the models. Till next time!